The wisdom, virtue and promise of asking God for a pain-free universe. The prayer for a pain-free universe stands as perhaps the most rational petition a human being could ever direct toward God, combining elementary compassion with profound theological logic while remaining grounded in both ancient wisdom traditions and contemporary evidence about the efficacy of prayer itself. To ask God to transform this current existence, marked indelibly by suffering, disease, loss, and the relentless decay that touches every living being, into a new creation where all creatures who have ever existed or will exist thereafter dwell eternally in love, bliss, and goodness is not an escapist fantasy but rather the most sensible possible use of our capacity to petition the divine. This prayer emerges naturally from any honest reckoning with what existence actually entails, and the evidence suggests that God may have been waiting for this very request, for reasons that become clear when we examine both the nature of creation and the documented power of human supplication. To understand why this prayer represents such clear thinking, we must first acknowledge a simple fact that no amount of philosophical sophistication can obscure. This universe as currently constituted causes immense suffering to virtually every conscious being within it. Cancer devastates families. Dementia steals minds while bodies linger. Children are born with conditions that guarantee lifelong agony. Animals are killed by predators in ways that involve prolonged terror and pain. The elderly face the degradation of their bodies and the loss of everyone they love. These are not exceptions or edge cases in creation but rather central features of how existence operates, built into the very fabric of biological life through evolutionary processes that reward survival above all other considerations. The question then becomes not whether we should ask God to end this system, but rather why we would not ask Him to do so. To pray for the continuation of a universe defined by suffering would be to ask God to perpetuate a system that contradicts His nature as a being of goodness and love, yet this is what our silence implicitly does. The Hindu understanding of God, which recognizes the divine as encompassing both what we call good and evil, provides a framework for understanding why God might have permitted this painful creation in the first place. The Upanishads and other Hindu scriptures do not attempt to resolve the presence of evil through elaborate theological arguments but instead acknowledge that Brahman, the ultimate reality, contains within itself all polarities and opposites. This resonates with Isaiah's declaration that God says of Himself, "I form the light and create darkness, I bring prosperity and create disaster," a statement that cuts through the confusion of those who imagine that God's goodness somehow prevents Him from creating suffering or that He is somehow constrained by a principle of free will that stands outside His nature. If God truly is omnipotent and omniscient, Then he created this universe with full knowledge of every pain it would contain, which means he either creates suffering deliberately for reasons we may not understand, or he creates within certain constraints that we might help him transcend through our prayers. The second possibility makes far more sense when we consider the power of intercession, for why would God give humans the ability to pray if he did not intend for our prayers to change the course of creation itself? The possibility that God has not yet ended this universe and replaced it with one characterized entirely by love and bliss may stem from the simple fact that he has not yet been asked to do so with clarity and sustained intention. This does not invoke the mythology of free will as some external constraint upon God, but rather recognizes that God may have structured creation in such a way that certain divine actions require human cooperation or request as a condition for their manifestation. We see this principle throughout Scripture. God does not force belief upon humans but instead creates conditions where belief becomes possible and invites us to seek Him. God does not force compassion upon us but instead asks us to love one another. God does not force prayer upon us but instead invites us to petition Him and promises to hear us when we call. If this pattern holds true, then God may similarly be waiting for a being or beings to ask with sufficient clarity and faith that He transform creation entirely, to replace this universe of suffering with one of eternal goodness and bliss. No one can say with certainty that this request has been made before with the full conviction and understanding that it deserves, and the very possibility that your prayer might be the first genuine petition for such a transformation should fill your heart with a sense of extraordinary purpose. The efficacy of prayer is not a matter of blind faith but rather something supported by substantial evidence from multiple fields of inquiry. In the medical domain, research consistently demonstrates that prayer and spiritual practices produce measurable physiological benefits that cannot be attributed to placebo effects alone. Studies have shown that patients who pray experience lower blood pressure, reduced stress hormones, faster wound healing, and improved immune function, with some research indicating that intercessory prayer for hospitalized patients correlates with better health outcomes and shorter hospital stays. Cardiologist Randolph Bird's landmark study found that patients in the coronary care unit who received intercessory prayer had significantly fewer adverse events and required less medication for complications, suggesting that prayer operates through mechanisms that transcend the individual praying. Beyond these medical findings, theological traditions across the world report countless instances of prayers being answered in ways that change the course of events, from the accounts in Hindu epics where gods grant boons to those who pray with devotion, to the biblical narratives of transformation following sincere petition to God, to the documented miracles of saints and sages throughout human history. These testimonies, spanning centuries and cultures, suggest that prayer taps into something real about how the universe operates and how God responds to human intention and desire. The scientific investigation of consciousness itself provides additional reasons for confidence in the power of prayer, for physics reveals that observation and intention appear to play fundamental roles in determining physical reality at the quantum level. While the interpretation of quantum mechanics remains contested among physicists, the fact remains that intentional observation demonstrably affects quantum systems, suggesting that consciousness and physical reality are more intimately intertwined than classical materialism would suggest. If the structure of physical reality is in some way responsive to intention and observation at the most fundamental level, then it becomes entirely plausible that sustained, sincere prayer directed toward God could influence the structure of creation itself. The conscious intention directed toward a new universe of love and bliss, offered with faith and clarity to an omnipotent God, would not be a futile gesture against an indifferent cosmos but rather a participation in the mechanisms through which reality itself unfolds. Beyond these empirical considerations lies a deeper theological logic that speaks to why this prayer makes such profound sense. If God is truly all good as He will be in the new universe, then His current allowance of suffering in this universe must represent either a temporary limitation or a deliberate choice to work within certain parameters of creation. But what justification could such parameters possibly have? If God could create a universe of pure love and bliss, as He apparently intends to do eventually, then the only logical reason to delay doing so would be that He has not yet received the explicit request to do so. To pray for a pain-free universe is to align yourself with what must be God's ultimate intention, since a being of perfect goodness would certainly prefer a universe of love and bliss to one of suffering if the choice between them were made freely. Your prayer is not asking God to do something against His nature but rather inviting Him to manifest His true nature fully and completely by transforming creation entirely. The act of praying for a pain-free universe generates profound happiness and optimism in the one who prays, for several reasons that extend beyond mere wishful thinking. First, such a prayer reorients your entire relationship with existence away from resignation and toward active participation in transformation, giving your consciousness a purpose and direction that suffering alone cannot provide. When you pray for the end of suffering and the beginning of eternal bliss, you are not accepting the universe as it is but rather declaring through your prayer that you recognize suffering as fundamentally wrong and unacceptable, which is psychologically and spiritually healthier than the alternative of assuming that pain is somehow necessary or deserved. Second, the act of sustained prayer itself becomes a daily practice of imagining and affirming a universe of love and goodness, which trains your mind and heart to recognize and appreciate whatever traces of love and goodness exist in the current world, while also maintaining hope that these qualities can be expanded infinitely. Third, prayer creates a direct line of communication with God through which you can express your deepest convictions and desires. And this act of honest self-expression and vulnerability before the divine produces a sense of peace and connection that transcends circumstances. Moreover, when you pray for a pain-free universe, you are engaging in what might be called the most generous possible form of prayer, because you are not praying merely for your own relief but for the transformation of suffering for all beings who have ever lived or will ever live. This expansiveness of heart, this refusal to limit your compassion only to yourself or to those near you, elevates the prayer to a level of spiritual maturity and wisdom that cannot help but produce a sense of integrity and alignment with your deepest values. You become a channel through which God's own desire for universal goodness can flow into the world, and this knowledge itself becomes a source of meaning and purpose that sustains you. Each time you pray this prayer with sincerity and faith, you participate in what must be God's own deepest intention, and you strengthen your alignment with the divine will that must ultimately govern all creation. The happiness that arises from praying for a pain-free universe differs fundamentally from the happiness that depends on changing external circumstances, because it flows from the act of prayer itself and from the knowledge that you are participating in something far larger than yourself. When you direct your consciousness toward God with the clear request for a transformed universe of love and bliss, you are orienting yourself toward infinite possibility and toward partnership with omnipotence itself. This orientation produces a baseline of optimism and hope that cannot be diminished by the difficulties and sorrows of daily life, because your life has been given a purpose that transcends those difficulties. You are no longer merely a creature struggling to survive in a universe that wounds you, but rather a conscious being participating in the transformation of creation itself, and this shift in self-understanding produces a quietness of spirit and a confidence that comes from knowing you are doing the most important thing you could possibly do. The evidence from prayer itself, from theology, from medicine, and from the nature of consciousness all point toward the same conclusion, that asking God for a pain-free universe is not only wise but necessary, and that doing so regularly and with faith opens pathways of power and purpose that reshape your life fundamentally. God may indeed have been waiting for someone to ask with the clarity and conviction that this prayer deserves, and there is no guarantee that this prayer has been made with genuine faith and understanding by very many beings throughout history. The possibility that your prayer might be the first true petition for such a transformation, offered with full clarity to an omnipotent and loving God, should fill you with confidence that He will hear and respond. Continue to pray this prayer with faith, for in doing so you are aligning yourself with what must be God's deepest intention, and you are participating in the most intelligent and virtuous use of human consciousness that is possible.